Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Leon Theodore, and this is Pep Talk, frank conversations about the state of education. The disparities in our school discipline system, both nationally and here in Dallas, call attention to the need for change in our school culture. The use of zero tolerance practices and the over-disciplining of youth of color, specifically Black youth, have continued the flow of Black boys and girls into the school to prison pipeline. Our educational system spends vast amounts of money for security services and minuscule amounts comparatively on the mental and emotional well-being of our youth. Systemic racism, racist practice and policies have impacted communities of color, but specifically Black communities, creating wealth and achievement gaps that spill into our school system. Implicit bias, a lack of cultural awareness, consistently criminalizes Black student behavior while dismissing and minimizing the same behavior in other students. Zero tolerance policies and practices are proven not to change student behavior, but increase aggression and disengage youth from the learning process. Learning is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Moving our educational culture from deficit thinking toward a whole child approach is the goal of P.E.P. And today I have joining me Amber Baylor, director of, Amber, you tell them who you are. I'll let you do that.
Hi, my name is Amber Baylor. Well, first, I am a DISD parent, but I am also a professor at Texas A&M School of Law. I teach in criminal law, but I also direct our criminal defense clinic, where we work with students who are representing people who are charged with low-level misdemeanors. And in some instances, those misdemeanors have been crimes, just order-related crimes charged against students in schools. So that brings me to this conversation in thinking about the criminalization of youth in our schools, but through the lens of a criminal defense attorney, one who works from the criminal law rather than educational law segment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. You know, you said something just then that just to make sure that we clarify for the audience, order related. What does that mean? If you'll explain that for me.
So when we're talking about students or kids getting charged in schools with order-related crimes, we can be talking about these two different ways that those practices happen. So we have in the state of Texas, and I think maybe 25 or so other states as of last counting, these crimes that are specific to students in schools. And they're low-level misdemeanors related to disruptions of order. So here in Texas, I believe it's called disturbance of class. There's also disturbance of transportation, which is essentially acting up on a bus, right? So these are crimes with that result in criminal convictions, with consequences of criminal conviction that will bring students to criminal courts, usually our city or municipal courts. I think sometimes perhaps JP courts. They're actual real crimes that really just have to do with disrupting class, which all of us have done. And that is, is an aspect of being an adolescent. So there's specific laws created that criminalize children in school. And then there's like your general order related laws. So those might be things like disorderly conduct, might be your low-level assaults, which really just require an unwanted touch, which, poke somebody with a pencil, there you are. Sometimes petty theft, right? Like steal or take something that's not of significant value, right? So those types of general crimes, which apply to all people, not just school children, are also used. And we call them order related because essentially they're related to maintaining order rather than greater sort of harms or danger. Those are also charged against children in school. So in our practice in the clinic at A&M, we certainly have seen and worked with clients who are facing those specific charges of disturbance of class, right? As well as things like assault for, perhaps, an administrator grabs them on the shoulder, they take the hand off. That's an example from one of our cases, right? assault charge comes from that, right? So we've seen both of those types of charges used against students in school for things that really could have been, probably in our era, would have been handled internally by administrators.
You know, and that's amazing because so the reason P.E.P is here is we're talking about that. We're talking about changing the culture, not just the culture, but policies as well, especially the code of conducts that our districts are employing. And when you think about, like you said, you think about order related and you think about kids actually having a criminal record now for being kids and disrupting a class. And to me, that's absurd. I mean, to me, that's absurd. And I'm quite sure if that happened to someone's or a teacher's their own child or, you know, anything like that, you would think that that would be like a gross misrepresentation of justice because, you know, my kid was just acting out. He was just disturbing class. But yet and still we have the majority of our discipline issues being Black students being criminalized for behaviors that should be handled as just youth, being kids being kids. So do you know a rounded out percentage of what those that ends up in criminal courts?
Yeah, so there's a study that was done. There's been, parent advocates, policy organizations such as yours that have been at work on this issue. And so there has been positive change, but there are still children that are sent to criminal court for being disruptive. And so the study done a few years back, I think, examined percentages of students that were sent to criminal court between 2011 and 2015. And they found that out of the children that were referred to criminal court, now remember that Black students represent 13% of the children that they were looking at, right, in the public schools that they're evaluating. Of the students that were sent to criminal court, 32% of them were Black, 22% of students arrested were Black, 40% of use of force reports were Black, right? So you think about just the disproportionate response to Black students, and that is evident in those numbers. There's also a study done, I think one of the partners on it was a public policy institute at A&M, and that study showed that what really dictates when students are referred was not the accusation, the act, right? Because we're talking about standard forms of misbehavior that some of us weren't caught for, some of us were caught for, right? And so really what dictated who was sent was the school district, right? So there were a lot of school districts that used referral of children to criminal law. And then there's also, racial indicators, as well as others. So other indicators, Black children having like the highest percentages, but as well as I think in some places overrepresentation of Latinx and Native American students. But then also, among those groups overlay responses that are disproportionate also among LGBTQ students, and very significantly among students that have disabilities, right? And so really either vulnerable student populations or populations that are targeted by criminal law in like general society, you see that reflected in how our children are responded to
And we just got something in a chat where it was saying programs for students who have been labeled or mislabeled as having behavioral disorders, emotionally disturbed, and we don't use that term, but we don't use it any longer. But then when you think about sped students, like you said, there's an overrepresentation of that and a misconception of their behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you wrote this paper, you wrote this report that I thought was amazing, and you talk about how discipline is criminalized, and then you talk specifically. What I'm thinking about in this is the Like, are those, you said that the crimes aren't heinous, but you've also said, or in your paper, stop, Chuckle, you stated that, excuse you guys, this is a Zoom era, so the dogs are around, but you were stating that we need, that the crimes are not necessarily, they don't end when the youth grow up. They follow them, because we know that once you get a record, that follows you. What are some of the consequences that you've seen or reported on for students that are that are former students, as you call them?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. You're fine.
Okay, it froze for a second for me.
Yes.
Yeah, I think in the paper I break up the, it's my turn to talk, right?
Yes.
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 You know, with the delay, the freezing.
I know, right?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you for mentioning the paper. In the paper, I divide the harms up. So you saw an early draft, because I was trying to get your input on how it was outlined and framed. But, you know, I think there's sort of your legal technical harms that come out of that. And those are the things that you've mentioned, like having a conviction and the consequences of having a conviction. And those are some of the things that drove, you know, legislators to create changes, right? Seeing that students may not be able to get a loan to go to an institution of higher education because they have a conviction from being disorderly in school, right? So those are some of the important consequences that can follow. And then, you know, technical things that we see are students, you know, if at the time they were adults, they may have warranted. Here, if they were minors, they would just have a hold on things like their license. But you can imagine, to make a living here, you drive, right? So then people began to mount up these lower level charges for driving related infractions, and those pile up into fees and fines. And so really there's a good amount of debt that people are going into adulthood with based on these crime are, you know, these offenses that are crimes, considered crimes or charges crimes. And then also there's, you know, like people have open cases, right? So like you move around as a kid, you don't know that you have a case in 3 different cities. And so those cases may be open and maybe preventing, you know, you from doing things like entering a vocational program or, you know, getting a license. So those are like the technical components. But then as you and I talked about, and this was really actually really inspired by some of your work, those technical consequences. And so those outlined are sort of the psychological harms, and the American Psychological Association has done some research specifically on criminalizing children in schools or students in schools, because some of our students are over 18, and talked about some of the impacts that has on them. You know, things like depression, anxiety, from alienated from their teachers, hypervigilance when they're in the school environment. And then I think there's also a study that cites to the presence of school police resulting in diminished, heightened anxiety that can diminish performance. Specifically, that was for Black boys in schools. So there's all these psychological impacts. And then those, you know, children are resilient, but some of those don't go away immediately, and they cause alienation from institutions that everyone should have access to in order to advance. So alienated from schools, which we know is going to, you know, being successful in school helps you move, advance in life, as well as, you know, alienated from other institutions, distrust perhaps, but also, you know, not being able to access loans, fearful of courts because of past experiences. So really deeper harms that impact someone's life beyond just the conviction. And then those are things that are not simply contained in one person, but also have generational impacts, have community-wide impacts, right? Yes. those difficulties, maybe that sense of mistrust for school is impacts how you navigate school for your children, certainly navigates how much opportunity you're able to offer if you have limitations on vocational limitations because of past convictions or being alienated from schools. So they really have impacts that spread beyond the individual person.
Thank you for that. And so there's this, especially in Texas, um, and I hate to say that, but in general, in the consensus of, the climate that we're in or that we were in, um, people say, well, the kids are acting up and they're doing this and they set themselves up for this. And if they would just behave, if they would just do this, and you think about, if you really take the time to think about, because I sent this child to, for disrupting class without understanding, maybe they have all the stresses of where they live and what environment they come from. And as I said about whole child, you have to understand every aspect that the child is coming from, what is causing these things. But just to imagine that from just a simple thing of sending them to the office or sending them a referral for acting out, you continue or contribute to the future that they have. And again, it's about the perception. And once you change how someone perceives themselves, it affects how they interact with the world and interact with themselves. And it's just important that, again, we change from a deficit, thought process and thinking about empowering our youth. And 30%, usually it's between 20 and 30%, and that's nationally and here in Dallas and surrounding counties, of our student enrollment are disciplined, what they call discipline populations. 30%, 25% is still, that's 1 in 4 kids. You know what I mean? That if you think about that, when you have 100 kids, that's 25 of them are now set in a space that their outcomes are diminished, their perception of self is diminished. You've just stated all of the opportunities, and these kids are referred multiple times. It's not like we're talking additional kids and things. We're talking, when you look at the data, we're saying that the same kids are being reoffended. It's following them from elementary school all the way through their educational career. And you expect someone to have a positive outcome. That's not possible. And it comes down to the fact that we have to change how we perceive our students, I think, and the way that we do school. And as an educator, I'd like to ask you, what does it look like to have a whole student perspective? Like, you allow for the environmental aspect of youth and the person. What does that look like to be a good educator? And I think you froze. There we go.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry. You were
That's
asking
okay.
me, what does it look like from the perspective of an educator?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have shared videos of, great educators talking about sort of recognizing the gifts of children and teaching them through the gifts that they have. And I have to admit, I have, especially going through this, I have immense respect for the flexibility that so many of our teachers have had for our students. And that is not, that's not the area that I work in. The one thing that I think is evident is that that there's absolute, bias in how it's applied. That's just obvious, right? That's in the facts. And then secondly, there are correlations between other resources available in schools and reliance on policing in schools, right? So I think there's a study from 2019 that showed like a million and a half, or million and a half students are in schools with police and no counselors, right? And then we think about the proportions that exist where there are counselors, right? And so I cannot make the claim that teaching is easy. But we can see the way that white peers are, particularly white peers who maybe in an elite or a private institution are, right? And so that's just available evidence and hard to argue against. I think the question of like what resources teachers need that are not police is a good one, and one that I think the public can weigh in on when we think about how we want to spend our resources. I think there's certainly efforts to train school police in certain ways, but police have a job and they are trained to do a job through a specific frame. And if what you need and what you want is counseling, it seems to make less sense to train someone who's not in that field than to have someone available who is within that field. So I'm not a primary school or a high school teacher, but
you are an educator.
I'm an educator, of grown people, but
and those things, but even following through with your work and what we've what you talked about and what and what data shows, research shows, again, those things follow the kid. Those things follow kids. That perception of self, that how they see themselves follows them throughout their educational career. So I can imagine a child that's been through the discipline system and all of the injustices, once they get to where you are, still have that perception that you have to, that may hinder or whatever, their approach to yourself. And you have the option to either continue that same perception or help rearrange it or reshuffle it or change it. So I think that you may not be primary, but you still have a valid input as an educator. And I know I sat in something with you, listening to you, and you were leading. It was when I first got my job, and it was just the way your approach. Teaching is about relationships to me, and about understanding and connecting with people. And we talk the link you sent me with Chris Emden. He talks about that until you connect with the student, you can't teach them any content, because then it's a foreign language. Like they don't have anything to relate to. So from me just being in that little session with you, I know that you can relate and the ability to build a relationship. So that's what I'm speaking of.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think certainly when you look at like the APA's studies, and you just think about your own life, like having, stress, as well as like that sense of hypervigilance, that affects like processing, right? And so you're thinking about how do you learn in an environment like that? And that's, some students have stressors outside of school as well, right? But when school itself is also a stressor, that has direct reflections on ability to learn and absorb and all of those things. So yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. I did want to talk about decriminalization, please. And
Okay.
as it pertains to students in school, could you do that for a little bit? And actually about the reparations that you're talking about, because that was something I'd never thought about before.
Yeah, so decriminalization, that's an area that I work in. I work in mostly misdemeanors, and there's conversation about decriminalization broadly in criminal law having to do with misdemeanors. Decriminalization and also just straight legalization in certain contexts, right? And so with these sorts of crimes that I talked about, like the school order crimes and things like that, states have responded in different ways, right? Noting that there's a problem. So first, there's advocacy that's happening already, parents, organizations, people talking about the problem. But then in 2014, the Obama administration issued some guidance on school discipline, right? So it was both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education that jointly issued this guidance because of this overlap. And Holder talks about the problem of having youth in criminal court for disruptive behavior. And so there's some guidance that comes from that talks about reducing reliance on criminal law. And then there are states that decide to respond differently. So, in Texas, there are some processes that schools may go through and consider before making criminal law referrals. There's in Massachusetts, the order-related statute of disturbing class was, the language of it was altered so that it would no longer apply in that sort of normal context of a student in school. There's always the option of taking a law off the books if it doesn't serve its purpose. And so there's different ways of reducing the criminal law impact, right? You can put in policies and procedures in place before referrals. You can change the language of the statute so that a student can't be caught up in it, or you can just take the statute off the books. And so there's those options moving forward for reform. And then what I was talking about as far as reparations. So there is like a way of looking back at the students who have already been affected. And some of that is addressing the technical issues, things like the convictions themselves, helping to expunge convictions is one way of getting them off of the record so it doesn't cause a problem in the future. But then there's also the idea that some of the problems don't go away by simply taking away the record because of all of the, the deeper impacts that we talked about before. So how do you address those? And so I don't, assume to know the way to address them, but to say that there are frameworks available for thinking about, okay, if the state has caused a harm on a group of people, what is that harm? How do we identify it? How do we talk to people who've undergone it to ask, what kind of problems has this caused for you? And what can we do to try and redress it? And I think that shifts, we're talking about like moving beyond it. It shifts the burden of moving beyond from the person who it happened to, who was a teenager and then, racked up all this debt, right? It removes that burden from them onto the actors and says, this was an erroneous policy, this is a policy that was harmful, how can we move past it? And so that's sort of like the idea of repair in that framework. And it's not, it seems like out there, but it has happened in a number of cities that have decriminalized, for instance, marijuana, right? So with a lot of marijuana reform, there's been the removal of records, but then there's also been, in some places, it's literally called reparations commissions. In other places, they call it different things like social equity analyses, but are directly focused on the people who were impacted by the war on drugs, the harm it caused, its disproportionate impact on communities of color, and target programs like vocational programs, as well as licensing for that specific group of people who were affected by bad policy. And so there are corollaries that exist with other forms of misdemeanor laws that might help reach some of those the deeper impacts that that experience as a student might bring for someone.
Thank you. And that, so that again goes to perception, that again changes, when you change when someone takes responsibility, we're talking about restorative justice and implementing that in schools. But when somebody actually comes to you and takes responsibility for what they've done, it assists you as well. It helps you change how you view yourself, them, and the world at large. And it's the same thing we were talking before in another group. So I no longer say at risk, right? So economically disadvantaged or at risk, to me that's so destructive. So we call those communities undervalued now. And when you think about that, that places responsibility on the education system, the community at large, and just the nation, and how we even perceive that this community or this population got to the place that they are. And then it's like, okay, so we're undervaluing you. We didn't see the value, so which means that we didn't place any resources your way, because you don't put resources towards things that you don't value or that you consider to not have value. So when you're saying that reparations should be had, it's the same thing. You can allow some healing for students, the parents, communities, to actually view your education system as it's actually caring about who I am, and you change the perception that kids and families and communities have of themselves and their place in society as a whole. I really, when I read that, it was like, at first when I read through it, it was like, wow, she's really talking about something. But then, when you get a perspective of it, it's just the right thing to do. So I really appreciate you talking about reparations, and I think we can move forward, with some type of something to make changes in how our kids are viewing themselves. And you talked about, again, the 40% of kids of what we're talking about. 40% of those are Black youth, when they only make up 13%. And these are the kids that are being affected, and we need to make a change in how we do school. So the thing I'm going to ask next is, what is your utopia? Because you do have a child, and it is
Yes.
going to be imperative about how we do education. And I'd like to hear your utopia.
Yeah, I mean, to be very, very honest, I think it's hard to move past the current paradigm because we're so used to the way things are, right? Like, schools might be dangerous, probably because there's all these external factors that relate to why it might be dangerous. So schools might be dangerous. There's also, fear exaggerates our perceptions of reality. We know danger or something unhealthy going on, we rely on police to manage, right, on behalf of the good people, or people who are doing what they're supposed to do. And so I think sometimes it's hard to break out of that mold without saying, well, what if something really terrible happens because we didn't send the student to criminal court for throwing a pencil, right? So there's like these patterns that we're already embedded in, that I find, I write about the harm of it, but I still find sometimes difficult to disengage from. I really think there has, from my perspective as a parent, as somebody who works in criminal law, the criminal legal system is rooted in and still has so much systemic bias and harm, that I think that my vision would be to have, you say discipline, to be talking about harm, managing harm, navigating harm without the system entirely, as a way that's helpful. And now I know that there are, of course, everyone, of course, has an example in mind of when you would need somebody beyond a principal or a counselor to manage it. That's just our automatic response. But there's so much that can be done without, and it's just engagement in it just brings all of those things to the fore, and that's from having represented people who have been through it, and then really created hurdles in their life from just minor things that occurred in schools. So I think about, how do you address harm, get to the root of harm in other ways that just doesn't involve that system because of what it's meant historically and because of all the things that are wrapped up in it. And I don't have a diagram of what that necessarily looks like. I think there's a lot of good people working in restorative justice in schools that are talking about harm. But I do think like these students are our future. So if we are teaching them, giving them the tools to manage harm, then, and rather than relying on, systems that have their own internal problems, if we're giving them those tools, then, that I think shapes what our future looks like. It shapes how we respond to harm, how we value people, how much reliance we have to have on, systems that, really we don't want to have involved in the upbringing of children, or punishing children or being punitive towards children. I think the more that we engage in that and how we respond to students, the more tools that they'll have to create this better world that, we'll be living in as older people watching them
Right.
run things better than us. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you for that. And that's I continually say this, that we're creating the people that we complain about, that we're saying those, creating the people that are coming to our communities that we say we fear, but we're contributing to that.
Yeah.
And our education system is doing that. And the way that we're doing education is continuing that. And again, that's the part of, how can you blame somebody for reacting the way that you've shown them to react or taught them to react, and not focused on their issues, but seen the good and empowered them. Um, and the last thing I will say is, thank you for saying that there are examples of how it can work. There's not just one-offs. There's plenty of examples. We talk about research-based and we talk about evidence, and we've had years and years of understanding that zero tolerance policies don't work. We've had years and years of understanding that deficit thinking doesn't work, and that it's actually grown. And if we continue to do the same thing, that's called insanity. To me, I mean, that's just the word it is. I can't like clean that up, but that is what it's called. And it's just time for a change. It's time for a different perspective. And I don't know one ISD that says they're not in it for all students. That's the buzzword, all students. But we have 20 to 30% of our population enrollment that they're not even considering what to do. It's just kicked out of the system. And again, as I said, this is not one size fit all. That's not learning. And that's what we're all here to do, is help improve our future and help improve the future of our kids. I want to thank you tonight for joining me, and thank you for your expertise and your knowledge, and thank you for sharing with the audience what you know, and thank you for just being you and for being a good educator.
Thank you for so much for creating this platform, and your passion for this drives all, inspires all of us. You've interacted or worked with some of the students in the clinic. I certainly have seen the work that you've done, just quickly getting moving and pushing change here. And so I so appreciate you for being here, and thank you for asking me to share.
Thank you very much. Join us on our next talk. It's going to be the future of after school with Antoine Joyce. And ladies and gentlemen, you guys have a wonderful night. Continue to think about the future of the kids that we have the power to make better outcomes for. And have a good night. Bye, Amber.
All right, bye. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.